Hello and welcome to session 5, part 2. And I'm Wayne Ball, and I want to thank you for clicking on this video as you continue to invest in your ability to study the Bible. You kind of sharpen your sickle, if you will. And so today we're going to really begin to talk about genres. In session 1, we talked about doing theology, and we wanted to get that out of the way because as we do genres, in every genre, one of the steps is to come up with theological principles from the text, and so when you learn how to do theology, you're able to do that. So we did that. Now we're going to get into genres, and the Bible is written in many different genres. And again, genres, in my own thinking, is just different ways of communicating, different ways of writing, and there's several different genres. Today we're going to go over Old Testament narrative. And you kind of treat Old Testament narrative and New Testament narrative in kind of in the same way. There are some minor differences. We'll get to that when we get to New Testament narrative. So Old Testament narrative, and then you have poetry. You have wisdom literature in the Old Testament. You have prophecy in the Old Testament. You have some apocalyptic scripture in the Old Testament. Some people even have a subgenre called law. Obviously in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and so a lot of different genres. You have major prophets and minor prophets, is all kind of contained within the genre of prophecy. And then New Testament, you have the Gospels, which is, as one theologian put it, it's more of a biographical sermon, but there are stories in there, so you can kind of call it a narrative. You have the book of Acts, which is historical narrative. Then you have the letters, and again, theologically, we call that didactic literature, which is the letters. They're not telling a story; they're just giving out propositional truths. Okay, doctrine, if you will. Paul's teaching doctrine in those letters. He's addressing certain issues in the churches that he's writing to, and so that's that. And then you have prophecy. Okay, there's some prophecy. Mainly what you have in the New Testament is apocalyptic literature, and that's the book of Revelation. And again, the difference between prophecy and apocalyptic literature is more global, and prophecy is more could be more personal or more specific as far as the Lord spoke to this prophet, say, go to prophesy to the northern kingdom, southern kingdom, or whatever. Or there could be prophecy where Jesus is prophesied, the birth is prophesied, and then there's fulfillment in the New Testament, so that's prophecy. But it's not apocalyptic in nature, meaning the world's going to be destroyed, or there's going to be some sort of cataclysmic event. There are things like that, but that's apocalyptic literature, not necessarily the prophecy. So we're going to talk about how to interpret each of these genres because, again, you don't want to really interpret, and you can't really interpret poetry the same way that you would interpret the book of Romans, because there's two different ways of communicating. Poetry is short, terse lines, and it's really using imagery, pictorial imagery, but also emotional words are being used to bring about a truth or a point. To whereas in the book of Romans, again, it's just straightforward doctrine and poetry, pictorial language, emotional language. There are some emotional language, but mainly it's just doctrinal teaching. So you have to figure out, okay, what are the rules to interpreting the genres? And so that's what we're going to go over in the rest of session 5. We'll have a few different parts. This is part 2, and we're going to cover as much as we can in each part. Again, I'm only keeping these around 15 minutes long because I know that your time is valuable, and it's hard to sit down and watch an hour-long lecture from anybody, especially me. So let's go ahead, and I have this on the full screen. Let me see if I can click on the right. There we go. All right, let's go ahead and make this full. And from the beginning. So let's just go through this. Again, I just want to say that the majority of the guidelines that I'm presenting came from, you see it there on the screen, Invitation to Biblical Interpretation by Andreas Kostenberger and Richard D. Patterson, a couple of great theologians. I do add my own stuff in there, but I go by their guidelines. Again, why reinvent the wheel? There's great scholars out there. Let's use their stuff. Last session we talked about this, so let's talk about Old Testament historical narrative, and that is a genre. And again, it encompasses not only the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, but again, First, Second Samuel, the Chronicles, Kings. So all those books, and they're large books, several chapters long, and they encompass most of the Bible. So this is really important. And so one of the first things we want to do, and we talked about this in an earlier session, is number one, we want to determine the limits of the passage that you want to study. Now, when you get into narrative, you're not necessarily studying passages, you're studying stories. So you really want to encompass the whole story that you want to bring about. And we're going to kind of illustrate. I'm going to kind of illustrate this as we go. We're going to go to Exodus chapter 1, and we're going to look at the birth of Moses. And there are several different. There are several plots, or not plots, but there are several climaxes and denouements in there, and we'll talk about that. But as we go, it says, determine if the story is an account or report, or is it in story form? So what does that mean? What if a story is an account or a report? Well, there's some portions in the Old Testament narrative where someone's giving an account, and they're giving an account of something that happened, and in that account they bring about something that God did. So it has a theological principle in that account. God saved us, and God called us, and here's what happened. So that's kind of an account. The report is someone is giving a report back to the narrator or to the writer who's writing the gospel. So, and then there's just story form, and what we're going to cover today is just a story form. Its story has a plot and characters, and it has the elements of a good story, and we're going to go over those elements here in a minute. And so that's kind of, you want to just pay attention to that. 3, examine the setting of the narrative. Pay attention to time and culture and geography. Setting is really important in any story. You want to get the background. You kind of want to get the surroundings of the story. Where is it set at? What part of the world? At what time? What was going on? This kind of really goes back to the historical, cultural context. What was the political situation? What was the religious situation? And so those things you really want to know, so you can set this narrative that you're reading, the story, in a proper context. And then any story, and this is true of any story, number 4 there is identify the parts of a story: the exposition, the plot, the tension, the climax, the denouement, and resolution. And we're going to do that real quick. Now, I'm going to switch to my Bible. I hope that the camera will follow. If not, you won't be able to see me, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me. Let me click on the Bible here. I don't see me popping up in the corner, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and look at this story. Now, exposition is information that is gleaned that sets up the story. It kind of introduces things, and so now I'm not going to read all of this, but as you see, this is the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, and talks about the 12 sons here. And look at verse 6. Joseph died, and all of his brothers, and all of that generation. So again, this is just background information that's really setting up now the story of Moses' birth. And you look at verse 7. It says, the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So one of the next things that we want to look at is conflict. And we kind of begin to see conflict rising here, but conflict really does rise in verse 8. Look, it says, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So now there is beginning to be conflict. Because the reason why we know is because it's kind of, why was this mentioned? Why is this in here? And so now we kind of get that there's a little tension building. And then look what happens. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply. And in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So here we have the new Pharaoh who's becoming a little self-conscious, maybe a little again, that mindset of, hey, if they come against us, they're it's kind of a self-preservation. So what they do? They enslaved them, and we see that in verses 11 and 12. And they're afflicting him, and the children of Israel are in dire straits. They're being afflicted. Says the Egyptians in verse 13 compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. They made their lives bitter, and so I'm not going to read all this to you. I'm just kind of skimming here. Says then the king of Egypt. Now here we're kind of hitting a climax. Because again, this kind of bitterness, this kind of work and toil and everything going on can't last. So now there's a climax. As when the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of them was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, and if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. And if it is a daughter, then she shall live. So now there's we're almost at the climax. Okay, he says, look at verse 17. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called to the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? So now we're kind of at the climax here. Okay, they were told to do something. Is told to put the children of the boys to death. They didn't do it, but the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, heard this, and now he's incensed. So now we're kind of at the climax. What's going to happen here? It says the midwife said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and they give birth, and the midwives can get to them before the midwives can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very, very mighty. So the climax was, the Pharisee, or I'm sorry, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, found out that the women wasn't killing the babies. He's mad. They say, hey, look, they're giving birth before we get there. Now we're kind of seeing a little bit of a donament, which is more of a de-escalation. And because the Pharaoh bought it. The Pharaoh said, okay, so it says in verse 20, that's kind of the resolution here to a certain extent. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. It says, because the midwives feared God, he established a household for them. Now, so this comes apart if you're doing a theology, and we talked about that in the last session. This is kind of important to add to your theology. It kind of tells you a little bit about who God is and what God will do if you'll obey Him, even in the light of you yourself may be punished for it. So, if we're getting into the theology of it, that's going to be very important. It says, then the Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So now he comes around. Now we're back being introduced to the climax, because again, the original problem wasn't solved. Okay, just the problem of the midwives was solved, but the problem of the king wanting to kill the Jewish males, that was still going on. And so now we see a re-escalation of the plot. I hope you can kind of see. This is what I'm going through, so you can kind of read and see how this is done when you're reading the narrative here. Okay, why just moving here? Well, let's go to Exodus. Let's go to chapter 2, verse 1. Here we go. It says, now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she had him for 3 months. Now, again, this is the birth of Moses, and this is still within that time frame where the Pharaoh's killing the males, the Jewish males, which I would include Moses. So what happens when she could no longer hide him? She put him in a wicker basket, sent him down the river. I'm just paraphrasing this. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. Now, listen to this. Now, if you're talking about theology, you want to get into God's sovereign here, God's sovereignty, God's providence. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile at the exact time when Moses' parents done this. And her maiden walked alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened up, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." So now we're in that tension part. What is the Pharaoh's daughter going to do now? Because again, her dad gave the order to kill all the Hebrew boys. Now she found one. It says, then the sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, his sister, so Moses' sister, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from among the Hebrew women, so that she may nurse the child for you?" The Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. So again, providentially, God is taking care of this. And now we see that the climax was Pharaoh's daughter finding the son. Now we're getting to see the dunamit, which is a de-escalation, because now she's calling the mother of Moses in to nurse the child. She had pity on the child. The child's going to live. And verse 10 is kind of the resolution. The child grew, and she brought him to Moses, or to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." So that's kind of one complete story. Let me switch back here to, there we go. Now, as we're looking at this, let me get back to the full screen here. There we go. It's loading. Okay, it's poetry. So we identified the plot here. I just kind of demonstrated that for you: the exposition, the plot, the tension, the climax of the dunamit, and the resolution. And so that's kind of how that works. Now you notice that the story was beyond chapter 1. It was chapter 1 and part of chapter 2 up until verse 11. Then another escalation begins, and that's the way the narrative works. Is there's escalation, okay, and then there's a climax, okay, and then there's a de-escalation and resolution, and it happens constantly in these stories. So if you're any story that you're reading in the Old or New Testament, these are the elements that you want to look for. They're in every story, and you want to identify those things, because again, you want to get the feel of the story, so you can your theology that you grasp from it will be right. 5, identify the protagonist and the antagonist. So the protagonist is the person doing the action, okay? So the protagonist in the story we just read would have been Moses' mother, the Pharaoh's daughter. But the antagonist is who? The antagonist is those who are trying to foil the plan. They're the bad guys. Well, obviously that would be the Pharaoh. Okay, he'd be the antagonist. So you kind of want to understand who the good guys and who the bad guys. And then number 6, identify the theological themes and principles. Now we talked a little bit about that in the story. Again, what did you learn about God? What did you learn about man? What did you learn about redemption? What did you learn about how should we relate with God? What did you learn about how we should relate with one another? Once you're able to identify those key theological themes, you'll be able to pick them out of the story. And then number 7, make proper application. Now that we know the themes, now that we know God is sovereign, now that we know God works all things according to his will, how do we apply that to our lives? Maybe some of it is, hey, don't worry. If something bad happens, know that God is working about for his glory and in his time. So that's kind of the how to interpret Old Testament historical narrative. And I'm going over a little bit on time, but I hope this has been helpful. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe, and you'll get notifications. I think you have to hit the bell, and you'll get every video that I post. If you find this on Facebook, which I share this to Facebook, share it. If you think someone else can get a benefit out of this, a blessing, share it. And it's just free Bible teaching. I went to school and paid a lot of money to learn this stuff, and I just want to be a blessing. So thank you, and I'll see you in session 5, part 3. So blessings until next time.